welcome to the Story Church London podcast. We're doing an episode of Partners in the Gospel with our friend Ben Virgo here at St. Paul's Cathedral, one of the most historic churches in the world. Ben is one of our partners in the gospel. We've got to do ministry together as we've moved here from the States, and we've really seen how God has been using him, his family, and others for the glory of his name. Ben is the director of Christian Heritage London, an organization that gives tours and has podcasts showing how the gospel has made an influence in this city and ultimately in the nations, with people like William Wilberforce, William Tyndale, George Whitefield, Charles Spurgeon, showing all these places around this great city how they made an impact here for the gospel. And so Ben does that to share this rich history of the gospel, to give us hope in how we should live today. That's not all he does. See, he uses those tours and podcasts to fund his own church plant, Victoria Park Community Church. And so I love that about Ben, that he's fully on mission. He and his wife Rachel are doing incredible ministry in Victoria Park. And so if you want to check out how you can support Christian Heritage London or Victoria Park Community Church, check the links below. We're so grateful to be on this tour with Ben today and give you a little insight into what he's doing in this city. Come check out Ben's story.
The people we're going to encounter this morning and today, there is no question. It's not debatable. They changed the world. At the end of this, if you're saying, well, didn't they all do well? We just wasted our day. But if instead, at the end of this, you're saying, so they all put their faith in my Jesus, well, then that might encourage us to imitate their faith. Now, when a non-Christian historian talks in terms of this man changing the nation, it raises a question. How? September 1737, George Whitefield preached his first published sermon. William Wilberforce sat in this room while John Newton preached from this pulpit. It was this man of grace and truth. And Wilberforce walked into this building, went and sat down in the vestry with John Newton.
As you're seeing all these different places where the gospel has transformed this city, would you pray for this city? Pray for London. Pray for Ben and his ministry, and pray that the rich history of the gospel here would flourish once again. So as you're watching this, just take a minute and pray for what God is doing in the city.
This way. This way.
So this is John Newton's old office?
Yeah, he used to walk in here.
Ben, we're in John Newton's vestry. This is one of the coolest rooms we could be. How do we have access to it? How do you have a key to every place this is? I mean, we're in the place where Amazing Grace was written. John Newton studied in this room. How did you find Amazing Grace?
Well, I myself had been brought up in a believing family where I was taught about the grace of God regularly. But I had a silly season where I was a teenager. I nearly died, I was very ill. And I ended up working at a hamburger place. I messed up my education and I was out of school for months. And then a man asked my dad, he said to my dad, how's Ben? And my dad said, he's not good, And he says, well, is he interested in music? My dad said he's only interested in music, because I was in bands. And he said, would he like to tour America with a Christian rock band? And so my dad came to me. Now, at that time, I'm working in a hamburger place. Would you like to tour America with a Christian rock band? I'm like, tour America with a rock band? Cool. And to my shock, though, I went out to the States, and there was this band. Outstanding musicians, very good musicians. But night by night, they would talk about the cross and the horror of the cross. It says of Jesus, his face was marred more than any man, like one from whom men hide their faces. And they would preach this horror. And I saw from the band that they were not sort of living on their righteousness. They were not saying, I'm good. They were saying, he's my righteousness. So after a month of this, I responded. Praise God.
We're drinking some of the best coffee in the city of London. These guys know what they're doing.
Ooh, oh my goodness, the flavors. Newton had been a particularly horrible person. He had been a slave trader. He had seen all kinds of horror. He had seen profoundly traumatic or traumatizing episodes. And he had been his daily experience. Yeah. He had witnessed horror. But he was caught in a storm one night at sea, and having pumped on the ship's pump from 3 a.m. till 12 midday, he was exhausted, lying on the bed in his cabin. He was then taken from his cabin and was strapped to the wheel. He's literally steering the ship through the storm. But that night, in that storm, he did something that was out of character. You see, this bitter man was an atheist. But holding onto that ship in that storm, he says, I prayed.
Yeah.
He said, I did not pray as a son to the Father. He said, I prayed as the ravens pray. He says, Lord, have mercy on me. He says, immediately what came back into my head was, but what mercy can there be for me? But as he later remembered, the Lord hears the cry of the ravens. So that was the beginning. He survives.
Yeah.
He said he quickly got a Bible and he started to read. And the man who would later write, Amazing Grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Put his faith in Jesus.
Amazing. So these historic people and these historic places, they matter to you a lot. And Christian Heritage London, and I know we've talked about you're a pastor, you're a father, you're a husband, but you also direct this thing called Christian Heritage London. And so what got you into that? Why did you start these tours? What was it that provoked you to do that?
Yeah, well, you'll tend to find most pastors, their friends, they have very close friends who are dead. So usually I meet people on my tours and I say, you don't have to say to them, you heard of Spurgeon? They'll go, oh yeah, I do this because of Spurgeon. They love these guys. That is a frequent case. I mean, I heard a guy who was planting a church in Texas. He said, my mission board, they said, what model will you use? And he said, Metropolitan Tabernacle, 1859. So it was like, and that's Charles Spurgeon's church. So here's a guy who's in Texas being inspired by a guy who happened to have history in London.
So are most of your friends dead guys?
Yeah. That is a delightful thing because I also run the Twitter accounts for many of these people, so I'm constantly reading them. And what's fascinating is you do start finding not only in them saying a lot of the same thing, but you find it developing, you start guessing, I think this is where he's going to go. And then you see, oh no, look at that, he turned in another corner. But that's so true as well, that's so beautiful. And you see them growing themselves. But not only that, but also you start to see delightfully the same traits in different men from different centuries. So you might be reading Thomas Watson, and he's saying something which later William Wilberforce will say. When you say, but that's the same gospel, which has blessed them both. So yeah, they become friends in that sense. Especially also, a lot of the things we quote are their journals, their private journals and their private letters, and they're being quite personal.
So you're doing these tours and sharing the gospel in various ways, and to various people, but same places, same stories, but you get to share the gospel with thousands of people over these tours over the years. How did you get started sharing these stories?
Well, what happened was that there was an organization called Christian Heritage in Cambridge. It was an apologetics organization. And they would run sort of events every few months, and they might get an apologist in to speak. And that apologist would, the idea is in Cambridge, there's a lot of students. So you'd say, we're going to have an event, we're going to have John Lennox speak or something. And so you get 100 people in a room. Well done. And some people who had been with Christian Heritage came down to London and said, we want to start that here. Now, and they asked me would I get involved at the very beginning. That was just over 10 years ago. And I realized early on, no one will come because I know London. Frankly, even if there's a great preacher across the road, we're busy. London is busy. You'll find people with multiple jobs and so on. And it's a busy, busy place. And people are very tightly in their little church group. So I thought that's not going to work. But what is going to work is the great apologetic of history, telling the stories, because the extraordinary stories of gospel breakthrough have happened in this city. And everyone loves these people. And each one of their stories only makes sense because of the gospel. You can't say, and John Newton decided to try a bit harder one day. And that was amazing grace. No, he understood the gospel. So people who come to London, they're interested to see what is it that established it. People who live in London, they could live somewhere cheaper, but they live in this expensive, dangerous, dirty city. They feel like they're attached to something substantial from history. And so it's a great opportunity. We'll take you on a walk through the stories. And we tell you, so where do you think hospitals came from? They didn't just burst out of the ground. They just didn't one day, what's that thing over there with ambulances? No, but you'll find they were Christians.
So you mention these people's stories. You're connected to these people. You run their Twitter accounts from the grave, right? Who do you feel connected with between Wilberforce and Newton, all these guys?
Yeah.
Who personally do you feel connected with?
Well, they all, as you say, they all become friends, and that is a genuine, you feel like that. I feel like when I see them, hopefully I will meet them in the eternal kingdom, and it'll be not like, who are you? It'll be, hey, all right. But and they'll say, yes, I am all right. Yeah. Yes, I'm in heaven.
I'm in heaven.
The people I feel particularly connected with are, well, at different times, different people.
Right.
So John Newton, pastor of this tiny little church, and Tim Keller says, greatest pastor I ever came across was John Newton.
Wow.
There's a church of 120 people can sit in this church.
Small
and
church.
I'm planning a little tiny church and feel like you're not really making any difference to anything. But John Newton, similar. He was just in this little church. And then you read him and you find he's writing again and again and again. 4 volumes of works, most of which are letters to individuals.
Yeah.
So, and he always comes back, in everything he writes, he comes back to the gospel. And he'll say, I don't know why he puts up with me, but I know his great grace. And he dies saying, 2 things I know, I'm a great sinner and Christ is a great savior. Extraordinary. So I love him, and I love Whitfield. I love Whitfield for this reason, because, funnily enough, we have become more and more prominent, and now Christian Heritage London is becoming a thing, and people know all about us all over the world. Whitfield had suddenly he was notorious, and people knew him, and you see that brings its own challenges, because Jesus has very, very frightening things to say about the rich, for example, and you'd think, no, it's easy for them. No, that's his point. Because you can put your, as it says in Proverbs, give me neither poverty nor riches, because if I'm rich, I may forget you. And I don't want to forget the Lord. So your heart must be being fed by the same Christ. Otherwise, well, it's going to be fed by something. And it could be being fed by, you're well known. And that's a faulty thing.
As we've come here to plant Story Church London, stories matter to us a lot. You are a storyteller. One of the best, one of my favorite in the city of London, for sure. But you're sharing the story of the gospel over and over and over again. How do you make sure that it stays fresh in your heart?
The only way it can stay fresh is if it's Jesus, because his mercies are new every morning. He says, whoever believes in me, living waters will flow out of them, living waters, which means I must be. As Luther said, I forget the gospel every day, I have to hear it every day. So I keep coming back to the gospel, which means I must be in his word daily, and I must be before him in his presence daily. And that is, I can't over-exaggerate that, because that has to be the thing. And that you will find in churches, the likelihood is, as every pastor knows, for one day you are everyone's hero, and the next minute everyone hates your guts. And if you are depending on, I'm their hero, then when they turn, when something goes wrong, and really they need a shepherd who's going to be saying, come on, let's go. Let's get away from those. Let's get over here. If you're going to get if everything comes from what they think of you at that time, that's not going to be strong. You've got to be being fed. You've got to have your soul in there. So how do you keep fresh? Well, the great news is the gospel keeps you fresh. There is only one thing which keeps you fresh. And that is the gospel of Jesus Christ.
You're in various types of ministry. You come from a family where the gospel was preached to you. You couldn't really avoid the gospel in your own household. And you are Terry Virgo's oldest son. Tell us, how did that shape your ministry? How does that shape your marriage? How you parent?
The great answer to that is that, first of all, I had a front row seat on church history. In this country, this network called New Frontiers was begun by my dad. It went, I think there's over 2,000 churches, maybe 3,000 New Frontiers affiliated churches now. All over the world. Tim Keller said it's the most impressive church planting network in Europe. Wow. So that meant I got to see something happen, and I saw how God does a thing. And seeing behind the curtain was priceless. Because, first of all, there's no trick, there's no technique. I remember just going past my parents' bedroom and just hearing hymns being sung. And as it came to it, you'd later think, so if God had a 50-50 call here and there's two guys, he's going to go with the man after his own heart. That's the way I observed things as my own read on things. And I saw that has to be the authentic thing. And my dad, as someone once said, you don't seem to just love God, you seem to like him. And you think, well, obviously, but to my shock, it's been a shock to see through the rest of my life how rare that is among clear evangelical believers. Do you like Jesus? You know? Because it's not obvious. That's a terrible thing. Isn't that what could be worse? What could be more offensive and unpleasant than to hear those words?
I mean, you and I are pretty rare, and we're both sons of pastors who have decided to pastor churches, which unfortunately is not always the case. And so to see not just you, but many of your kids are actually in ministry is a really beautiful thing, kind of a generational blessing from one generation to the next.
Yep.
And so you and your wife Rachel chose to not just pastor a church, but to plant a church in East London and Victoria Park. Tell us a little bit about that and why you chose that space.
Yeah, well, we just lived there. We didn't really choose it. We couldn't afford to live anywhere else. We live in government housing. We live in we live in what in America they would call the projects. And the people around us they just are from Bangladesh. I have never felt called to Bangladeshi Muslims. They're just the people I live around.
Right.
And that is so important to hear that, because there was no sense in which we felt like, oh yes, we feel the call to these people. We just believe instead that Jesus is making very strong comments frequently about your neighbors.
Yeah.
And you tend to find, well, what is that going to look like if you're reaching your neighbors? Well, he also uses terms like church and local churches, people one anothering one another. The number of times Paul uses that term, one another. One another. And a number of times Jesus talks about your neighbor. And you find that's how the gospel is supposed to be. That is how the gospel is supposed to be, and applied. And if you're going to a church where you have to travel, an hour to get there, do the people who you live around know your hope? Do they? And that whole the opportunities that we have for relationship, and Jesus says they'll know you're my disciples from your love for one another. So we just wanted to see those convictions applied.
Right.
And that's why we're planting a local church in East London.
Beautiful. What advice do you have for me as a friend, but as a pastor, a church planner in London?
Well, what you've done already has been so exemplary in that, firstly, you've come. Secondly, you have developed relationships with people who are already here. You haven't come in saying, forget you guys, you've got to know people. I go up to people and say, do you know Adam Watson? And they often say, yes, I know Adam Watson. If they say no, I say, it's a matter of time. You will know him soon. Because you're doing well getting to know people, and there's a relational priority. Thirdly, I think the advice of now start, but also I would say this, the people who you encounter, each one of them. I mean, there was an encounter once at a well, and the woman was like, oh, not her, we're waiting for the guy, not her, we just keep waiting. No, she was the one. And that got written about for the rest, and read about for the rest of time, that woman at that well.
Right.
It's awesome. And then, so it's the person we have an encounter with, and you start praying for them. It might be a neighbor, literally, it might be the postman.
Right.
It might be this person I started to work with, and a person made in the image of God, who I know will only find satisfaction in the Christ I have found. And therefore, it's prioritizing the people who are with us.
Yes.
If God is going to give us increase, it will only be because we've cared for the babies He already gave us. I'm convinced of that, I think. And cared for will mean, as a shepherd, occasionally saying, don't go there.
Right.
There's nothing there. Right. So we've seen little growth in our church growth. But what I see, which has been beautiful to me, is it's been like a pruned rose bush. Right. Because there have been times where we've said, I'm sorry, we're not going that way. And people say, well, I'm going. And then they don't go anywhere. And we've seen, instead, with the people who are with us, we see life coming through and health.
Thank
you for your time.
It's great to see you, my friend.
Friend in the gospel. Let's continue to do this thing. Yeah, baby. Rock and roll. God be the glory.
Yeah, amen.
Yeah, baby.
Avengers. An apple. What are we here?
We really hope you enjoyed that time with Ben and getting to know more about Christian Heritage London. If you're interested in supporting the work of Christian Heritage London or their church plant, Victoria Park Community Church, you'll find the links below in the video. Please like, subscribe, hit the bell. We'd love to share more stories with you about what God is doing in this city. Thank you guys. We love you.